Nobody was supposed to read this. That is the first fact worth sitting with about the book historians now call the Meditations, written by a Roman emperor who never gave it a title, never prepared it for an audience, and very nearly did not survive in any form at all. Picture him in one of the frontier provinces of Central Europe, the empire's business handled for the day. He takes out a notebook and writes himself a correction. Not a speech. Not a decree. A note to himself, in his own hand, about something he apparently still had not learned. There is of senators. Just a man far from Rome, writing in whatever he had on hand to write with, doing something that has nothing to do with ruling an empire and everything to do with staying fit to rule it. The popular version of this story has him doing it every night for 12 years, alone by lamplight, turning each day's failures into wisdom before sleep. It is a vivid image, and it is more precise than the record actually supports. What can actually be shown is a little less tidy, and in its way more interesting. The notebook was written, at least in large part, while Marcus Aurelius was on campaign in Central Europe, probably across the years 171 to 175. Some entries read like morning preparation. Others read like a man catching himself mid-mistake. Nothing in the surviving record fixes a nightly ritual, a specific hour, or an exact span of years. What the record does show is a man writing to himself, again and again, for long enough that the habit produced an entire book. That book almost did not reach anyone. Scholars studying the text have as though it may have been composed separately from what follows. And the version we read today survives through an unusually narrow channel. A manuscript that ended up in the Vatican, and a second manuscript, now lost entirely, that an earlier editor used to produce the first printed edition in 1558. If the lost manuscript had simply gone missing one stage earlier, before anyone copied what it held, none of this would exist for anyone to read. The book survived by an accident that had nothing to do with its author's intentions, which is a strange fact to sit with, given how much of what people now quote from it was never meant to be quoted by anyone at all. Multiple sources describing the work agree on why it was never prepared for wider readers in the first place. He wrote it for himself, and for his own use. Whatever survived, survived by chance. So what does a notebook like that actually contain, once you open it? Not essays. Not arguments built to persuade a reader. Something closer to a checklist, repeated in different forms, addressed not to himself as I, but to himself the way a diarist addresses a page. This is worth separating from a different Stoic discipline already covered elsewhere. The practice of rehearsing disaster in advance, imagining what could go wrong before it happens. What fills these pages runs the opposite direction. It looks backward, at a mistake already made or a lesson already half learned, and tries again. Begin the morning, he tells himself in one entry, by saying to thyself, I shall meet with the busybody, the ungrateful, arrogant, deceitful. Not venting. He is loading the day's likely irritations into memory before they arrive, so none of them can ambush him as a surprise later. In another entry, waking itself is the subject. In the morning when thou risest unwillingly, he tells himself, let this thought be present. I am rising to the work of a human being. Not a pep talk. A job description, repeated to a man who apparently needed reminding that getting out of bed counted as part of the job. The reminders are not always this precise. How long thou hast been putting off these things, and how often thou hast received an opportunity from the gods. In a different entry he gives himself something closer to an ultimatum. Since it is possible that thou mayest depart from life this very moment, he writes, regulate every act and thought accordingly. Neither of these reads like a man recording a triumph. Both read like a man still working on the same unfinished problem, addressed again because the last attempt evidently did not close the file. Elsewhere, 4 words. All is opinion. Read enough of these entries in sequence and a pattern appears that has nothing to do with inspiration. He is not writing down wisdom he already possesses. He is drilling a small number of ideas into a mind that keeps forgetting them, the way an athlete drills a movement the body already technically knows and still cannot perform under pressure. The notebook is not a monument. It reads more like a maintenance log for a mind that kept relapsing into the same handful of failures. Impatience with people, resentment at interruption, self-importance about a job that was, in his own account of it, mostly interruption. There is an obvious question underneath all of this. Why would the most powerful man in the Roman world need to keep telling himself the same handful of things? Power does not, on its own, make patience automatic or interruption pleasant. If anything, a life with almost no one able to say no to you removes most of the ordinary friction that teaches other people these lessons by accident, through consequence. Marcus Aurelius had to install the friction himself, on paper, because the world around him had mostly stopped supplying it. There is a reasonable case, though this part is interpretation and not something the text can confirm on its own, that addressing himself as you instead of I did some of the work. A small distance opens up between the person giving an instruction and the person who has to follow it, close to the distance a coach has from the athlete being corrected. Whether that distance was deliberate, or simply how the Greek happened to come out of him, no surviving source settles. What is not in doubt is that the notebook reads this way, entry after entry. A voice correcting a you who keeps needing the same correction. That is the part most retellings of this story skip. It is easy to find the finished aphorisms and forget that a person who needed to write himself the same correction more than once was, by definition, someone still failing at it in between the entries. The book is not evidence that he became a calmer or better man. It is evidence that he kept trying to, in writing, long after any of it might have simply become second nature. Centuries later, working from an entirely different set of assumptions, a psychologist ran a controlled study on what regularly putting difficult material into written language actually does to a person. In 1986, college students were assigned to write for 15 minutes a day, 4 days in a row, either about something traumatic or about something ordinary. Over the following 6 months, the students who had written about the difficult material visited the campus health center at about half the rate of the students who had written about ordinary topics. Nobody in that study was reenacting a Roman emperor's private notebook, and the two practices are not identical. But the underlying act, taking something unresolved and giving it enough structure in language to actually look at, connects a military campsite in the 170s to a psychology lab in the 1980s more directly than the years between them would suggest. Nothing about a 1980s writing lab proves what was happening inside a Roman emperor's head 2,000 years earlier. What the study does establish is that the general mechanism, structuring difficult material in language rather than leaving it unformed, is not just a literary habit. It appears to do something measurable to the body carrying it around. Marcus Aurelius had no access to that data and would not have cared about it in those terms. He seems to have found the same leverage point by trial and error, entry by entry, without ever needing a control group to tell him it was working. None of this is a claim that writing to yourself fixes anything by itself, and it is worth being precise about where the practice stops being useful. What these pages describe is correction aimed at a specific failure, followed by a return to the work. It is not a spiral. It does not read like a nightly accounting of every way he fell short as a person, and it does not read like self-punishment dressed up as discipline. If writing about a hard day ever starts to feel like that instead, like rehearsing the same wound without ever putting it down, that has moved from philosophical self-examination into something a notebook cannot treat, and it is worth naming to a professional equipped to help with it directly. None of this is medical advice, and the practice itself is not a treatment. It is a record of maintenance, kept by a man who apparently needed it. What he actually did, some nights or most nights, in a tent or a fixed camp, across years that no surviving source pins down exactly, was smaller than the legend himself. He kept returning to the same 3 or 4 unresolved places in his own character and wrote them down again, addressed to a you rather than an I, until the writing itself became the practice worth keeping. None of the 3 or 4 things he kept correcting in himself ever fully went away. That is not a failure of the practice. It might be the most honest part of it. That is a strange kind of inheritance to leave behind. A book that exists only because a private correction, repeated often enough, eventually fills. If you have ever written something down purely to get it out of your own head and nowhere else, the comments are open, and it is worth naming what that actually felt like at the time. The next video stays with this same instinct, looking honestly at yourself, but through a method that used other people and spoken questions instead of a notebook and a pen.